How did you get into the natural community and deciding on a home birth?
Oh gosh. My first son was born, I was had just turned 19 when he was born, so I was very young. And when I found out I was pregnant and needed to go to an OB, my mom, who was a labor and delivery nurse, suggested I go to her favorite practice that she worked with, and they had midwives and OBs. And the first person I went to see to get my first ultrasound was an OB. And I was, of course, scared. I was 18. I was scared and overwhelmed and didn't even know. I found out I was 9 weeks pregnant, and I hadn't even known I was pregnant until a few days before. And it was like very scary. And I remember her being really cold and really dismissive and rude. And I was like, I told my mom afterwards, I was like, I didn't like her. I didn't like that way. And she was like, well, the practice has midwives. I think you might really like the midwives. I think you should try. I think she said that I would really like Nancy or Mary. There were two midwives that she thought I really liked. And so I scheduled with one of them, and I did really like them. They were really friendly, nice. They were CNMs who worked in the hospital. And I ended up having my baby with one of the CNMs. The only thing was, I didn't know about the politics at the time, but in the city that I lived in, Austin, Texas, apparently there was a big political thing going on right about when I gave birth in 2000. And the OBs didn't want the midwives in the hospital. I don't understand why, because again, I was young. I don't know what the deal was, but the midwives all got kicked out of hospitals. Like, there was no midwives in hospitals after, I think it was 2001. So shortly after my baby was born, for several years. So there was no where you could have a midwife birth in the hospital for several years in Austin. And that was all an undercurrent when I came in labor, or I was induced, but I went right into labor. And instead of calling my midwife, because the plan is with the induction, it was supposed to be like an overnight induction, and in the morning, when you're actually laboring, they call the midwife. Well, I went into labor a few hours after they put the Cytotec on my cervix, and they did not call my midwife, even though they were supposed to, because of this whole undercurrent of, and she ended up not getting called until after I had been laboring for several hours, and it was really hard, and I was like alone, and I ended up getting an epidural, and then they called her, and she was mad. She came in like, why was I just now called? She didn't even want an epidural. Like, I could have been here with her. And he was born with an epidural, and afterwards I kind of felt like, oh, that wasn't what I planned, but he was born healthy, great. Then I got married and wanted to have another child, and was looking at the possibility of, where would I have this baby? And my ex-husband now, his mother had home births she'd actually had him unassisted and his sister with a midwife. And she was like, oh, you want to do home birth? And the one who had delivered, his sister 20 years before, was her best friend. And she was a certified nurse midwife who delivered at home, which is rare. And she was like, you should use Anne. And I'm like, okay. And I started reading. She's like, read this book. And I started, I watched The Business of Being Born, and I read, all the NMA Gatskin books, and just kind of went. I had been like in the mothering. It used to be a big online group, mothering. It came from a magazine, and I remember somebody had given me the magazine when I was parenting my first child when he was a baby, and I breastfed him and wore him in slings. And so I loved the magazine. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like promotes breastfeeding and baby wearing and all the stuff I do. And it also promotes home birth, but I had never heard about it until reading about it in there. But it was kind of like, oh, that's a thing you can do. But it only became something I think I could do when his mom was telling me about it. And then I was like, there's no way to have another midwife in the hospital. Like, I don't want to have an OB. Like, my only experience with OB was, ugh. And, his mom said it's great. And so I had a home birth with this, her best friend. And that was my second child. And I mean, I suppose it all went fine, but it was horribly traumatic. People talk about their traumatic, like, hospital births, but what ended up happening, I had a very slow labor, and I think the midwife was just tired of waiting. And when she checked me, and I was only like 6 or 7, she said, "Oh, you have a lip," and she pushed it out of the way. And she was pushing it. She's like, "I'm just gonna push this lip," and I'm like screaming at her to stop. Like, it hurt worse than anything that I've ever, like, the pain was horrible, like somebody sticking hot pokers. And I was like, "Stop screaming, stop." And she wouldn't stop. And it felt like, I mean, I understood when people were talking about birth rape after that, because after it happened, shortly after she pushed it out of the way, then she's like telling me to push, she's telling me, "Stop screaming and push, stop screaming and push." Baby came out, she leaves, baby's healthy. I should be happy. I feel guilty and horrible. And I feel like somebody assaulted me, even though, I felt guilty. I'm like, baby's healthy. I mean, she had to do it, right? It felt like all the feelings of, having been day raped. I mean, I understood where that came from, because that's how I felt. And so I'm like, I thought that was only supposed to happen at the hospital, but apparently that happens at home too. And so when it came time to have another baby, I was like, I don't want to have a baby with that woman again. And in my mind, I tied it all to, well, she's just too medically minded, and maybe she's too hands-on. Like, I don't want anyone to touch me, like, unless I say it's okay. So my birth, what is that called? When you do a class for birthing, I had done a class when I was pregnant with my second child. And the lady who had taught that class was training to be a midwife then. So years later, when I was going to have my third, I contacted her because I heard she was licensed, and she said, "Yeah, I'm licensed." And I'm like, well, I told her all about my last birth, and I'm like, I want to have a home birth, but I don't want to be checked unless I say. I don't want to be like, I really would prefer to try to check myself. I would prefer to not have your hands inside me. And she was like, "Well, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. We can see." And she at that time worked with the same midwife who worked with the other midwife. So the other midwife who'd been at the birth was who she worked with. And I was like, I don't want her there. I was like, I don't want to see either of those women ever again. So it has to be somebody else. And she's like, "Well, I'll find somebody else." It ended up, what happened when Sebastian was born, this is my third, she showed up with nobody. And I caught him in the bathtub, and she was just right there. And it was like the perfect birth, that all the goal for having the water birth, and the almost pain-free, and like hands off and perfect. And that was the end of my good experiences with, I've had them all, I guess. I've had the hospital birth, and then I had the horrible home birth, and then I had a great home birth, and then I had what is really a horrible home birth with Aquila.
So how was your pregnancy with your midwife?
With Aquila's birth? It was fine. I was healthy. I passed every test. I'm trying to think of anything was weird at all. I mean, everything was just exactly how it should be. I don't think I even had up until right before birth. So a week before birth, up until that, everything was totally normal. Then I did get sick. I got I thought I was going into labor because I started feeling contractions, and then a few hours after that, I was freezing, which is, for me, I should have known, because as soon as I get a fever, even before my temperature is above 99, I start getting cold. That's my first sign. I feel so cold. And I came home from this Bible study that I'd been at. I had to I was like, I have to take a shower. And I got in the shower, and I was in there so long, the hot water ran out, and I couldn't get out. I had to call my husband to get me out because I couldn't move because I was shivering. I had a fever. And we called the midwife because I was contracting, and I was shaking. And I had 102 fever. And she came over and was like, "Oh, well, I'm going to draw blood and get a CBC run today." And so she drew blood and sent it off. And like 2 hours later, it came back and she didn't understand the numbers. I still don't understand to this day why she had a CBC run if she didn't know how to read it. So like, she was like, I don't know what this means. And like, so we had to go into the emergency department that was by me. And that doctor ran another CBC and like a urinalysis and said, you're really dehydrated because you have a virus. And he said he had 10 kids and he had no problem with home birth and you'll be great to have a home birth. He did offer if I wanted to be induced because I was 39 weeks. He said, we can induce you now. And I'm like, I feel horrible. There's no way I want to be induced. Like, I just want to go home. And I went home. It took, a few days for me to recover, probably like 4 days before I started feeling okay. And then a couple days later, I was overdue at that point, and I did castor oil in the morning, and then went to sleep that night, and at midnight woke up with my water breaking. So, and that was the day she was born, midnight, the night of the 18th, the morning of the 19th.
So what happened after your water broke? Did you call your midwife or?
I texted her. So my water actually woke up at midnight and I was like, why am I awake? And then I felt a pop and then a gush. And I had luckily put down like a pad on my bed the night before I went to sleep. So I was so glad. I was like, I'm so glad I laid that down. This is literally the only time labor started with my water breaking. And it like filled that pad. So I'm like, I had to wait till it stopped so I could stand up and go to the bathroom. And I'm like, I got up and I like texted my midwife and said, and my my friend that was going to be like my doula, I texted her too, to let them know. And she was like, well, let me know if anything, happens, like we're getting any contractions. And I stayed up till probably like 4 and wasn't really feeling anything except maybe like a contraction here and there, nothing enough, and ended up falling back asleep for a few hours and then getting up at like 6 and being up for the morning.
And how long till she was born after that?
So she was born at like 6 in the evening and water broke at midnight. So I think it was close to 18 hours. Yeah, from when my water broke.
Was your midwife there at all?
Yeah, she got there. Goodness. I really would have to look to be certain, but I know that it was around 11 when my doula friend and the photographer got there, and I had somebody that was there to braid my hair because I wanted it all like a little really long hair. I wanted it all braided and put up so that it wouldn't get messy. And so she was braiding my hair at like 11 something, and Faith wasn't there yet. It was a few hours later, maybe 2, that she finally showed up, because it was like light labor. And it's like in the home birth world, it's like, the midwife doesn't come until, you're like, oh, this is so hard. They say the midwife's going to be with you the whole time, but that is not the way that they're like, we come when you're like, you can't handle the contractions anymore. That's when then they come,
Yeah, that's exactly when they come.
Yeah.
So what happened as you were laboring and contractions started getting more? Like, what was going on?
I was in the tub when she did get there, and it was good, strong contractions. And this is the part, forgive me, because it's been, over 10 years. So it's been, and I've had multiple births since then. So some things can get fuzzy and I have to check back. When everything was still very, very clear, like for, 2 years afterwards, everything was like crystal clear, which is not normally the way it is after labor. Everything kind of gets fuzzy anyways, but it took a long time for things to get fuzzy with Aquila's birth. But now I'm like, you're asking me times. I was laboring in and out of the water, and I think when she got there, she took my temperature again, because we had the high temperature the last week, and then my temp was kind of high. It was like over 100. I don't remember if it was over 101. It definitely wasn't as high. It wasn't like 102. But so she was saying, oh, you're hot because you're in the tub, and the tub is really hot, so we need to get you out and cool you off. And the baby's heart tones were high. I remember even when she first got it, they were over 160. They were high. And she said, that's because you're too hot and you're making the baby's heart has to work harder because you're, so hot. She did not take my, pulse or blood pressure or check me, which is one of the few things she got in trouble for later, was that she didn't check any of that stuff with me. Like, she just kind of Dopplered the baby and took my temperature, and that was it. Which is not a full assessment of someone's, in labor. I don't know how many times I got in and out. I do remember being in the tub and trying to check myself, because like the previous birth with Sebastian, I had checked myself and I was like, I don't feel a lot of cervix, but when I had checked myself, there was like chunks of like blood clots that floated into the water about yay big. And I'm like, why are there clots of blood? And she's like, oh, that's just bloody show. And she wrote down that it's bloody show, but it was nothing like bloody show. They were like clots. And when I got out, the next time I was dribbling blood, and not like amniotic fluid, not pink, but like blood. And she was like not concerned by that. And then the contractions got to where they were just back to back. They did not stop. They didn't have a like up down. They wouldn't stop. And I kept saying, they won't stop. They won't stop. I want to go to the hospital. I want an epidural. In all her notes, it says that I was refusing transfer, but it was the opposite of that, because I was saying, I can't handle this. Like I had given birth without medication twice before and never said I can't handle this, even when pushing. And I was like, I can't do this because there's no break. I can't. It hurts so bad. And she disappeared for like 20 minutes and during all this, where I'm pictures of me just hanging on to my husband at the time, like just screaming with my head back, screaming because it hurt so bad. And she was gone, and nobody knew where she went. She said later in the deposition, or the I don't know which one, the hearing, that she was calling another midwife to ask how to convince us to transfer, even though she had never suggested transferring or said anything about hospital or anything. By the time she came back, I had convinced my doula and my husband that I wanted to go to the hospital. I didn't care what she said, and they had gotten me dressed. It took like the 20 minutes to get me dressed because the contractions wouldn't stop. But right before that, she had checked me on the bed. She did check me. She said, you're only a 6. And the pad that she had laid down, like a Chuck's pad, when I stood up, it was covered with what looked like vomit. Like it was like brown. I guess later I found out that was meconium stain. She just said there was bloody show. Again, I remember seeing that Chuck's pad covered in brown stuff, like, and thinking, what is that? And I remember saying, my mom had a baby die of an abruption. And I wasn't even thinking, like, I still don't know why I said that. I remember saying it, but it was like this out of body experience, because I wasn't thinking I was having an abruption. I wasn't thinking. I was so like out of it, like being on drugs, like, because the pain was so intense that I was just not sensical at all. I just was like, I want to go to the hospital. I want an epidural. I want an epidural. And so after the checking me, then she left. And when she came back, they had gotten me dressed, and it took 20 to 30 minutes just to get down the stairs, because I had to go, because I had to keep stopping. It was like every step was just torture. To walk in intense labor is something else. So made it down the stairs, and my kids were watching TV downstairs in the living room, and passed them to go outside. And then I find out when we're walking outside, it's like, oh, you can't go in my car. You need to go in Amy's car. That was my doula. And I'm like, what? Why would I go without my midwife? Like, she was going to go in a separate car. Turns out she put all her bag, like her supplies, in the back seat, in her trunk of her car. And then she was hopping in her car. Amy had climbed in her driver's seat. I was climbing in the passenger seat. And as I'm climbing in, I got that all of a sudden absolute, I have to push now feeling. And I booked it back inside. And that point, it didn't hurt. Like, it stopped hurting, and it was just like, I push, and I just like made it back in the door, just to the couch right inside the door, and climbed up and just pushed her out into my own hands. And Faith came up behind me, and I like, because I was like facing the back of the couch, like I climbed up on the couch and just delivered her into my hands on my knees. And then I kind of like turned to the side and sat down and had this baby right here in front of me. And then Faith there trying to work on her. She didn't have any tools, not even a bulb syringe. She just picked Aquila up and sucked and was sucking bloody mucus out of Aquila's mouth. Aquila came out with just blood coming out of her nose and her mouth, and Faith was sucking it out of her mouth and spitting it on the ground, the blood that Aquila was like, basically looked like she was drowning in her blood. And it was just, there was just blood everywhere. Everything was completely stained in blood. Like the couch had to be thrown out. My clothes were all covered because when she was born, there was just so much blood because I had had an abruption. So it was just a ton of blood. And she yelled, in between sucking the blood out, she yelled for somebody to bring her a bulb syringe. And my husband ran off to get our birth kit because, you know, when you have home birth, you have to have your little birth kit. So he ran and got that, which had a bulb syringe in it, and gave it to her. And she tossed her keys to my photographer and told her to get her bag out of her trunk because she had locked her equipment in the trunk, which had like everything that they bring. She wanted the Delee, I think that's what it's called. It's like a little like tube that goes into your mouth, and then a little canister, and then a tube that you put into the baby's mouth to suck out, like especially for meconium, to like suck the stuff out. She was using the bulb syringe when Katie came in with the bag, and then she started the Delee, and she was doing, she asked somebody to give her something hard because she was trying to do CPR on the couch, and the baby was going into the couch. And I have had to take CPR a few times since then. It's absolutely traumatic for me to watch the baby dolls, because it literally was what it looked like. Like if you've seen she looked like a doll, and it was like, so when I see the dolls, she was completely lifeless and limp, and so it was like, that's exactly what it looks like. And it's like, I will forever have that burned into my memory of her doing CPR on her on the couch. And somebody gave her a note, like a binder, a hard binder that I had a bunch of recipes and stuff in that they had stuck underneath her. And I remember it was stuck in the bag of stuff that came back from the hospital, and it had blood all over it. And I remember getting it to smell it, to try to smell what she smelled like. It was so morbid, but I couldn't throw away this like completely ruined binder because it was what was underneath her, that she put underneath her to hold up her body while she was doing CPR.
And did they call the ambulance or anything?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of what point she told Gabe, my then husband, to call an ambulance. See, when we had been talking about transferring, when I said I want to go to the hospital, I want an epidural, I said, I want to go to the hospital. And Amy, my doula, said, should we call an ambulance, when they were trying to get me down the stairs? And Faith said, no, it'll be quicker if we just go in our cars. So I said, I want to go to a hospital. My doula suggested we call 911. And then the midwife said, no, we should just go in our cars. And so had that happened, you know, by then the ambulance would have been there. And that is forever just, I just hate that she made that choice to go, no, we're just going to go in our car. It'll be faster. It was not faster. So she had to tell my husband while she was waiting for her stuff to come back in the car. So while she was bulb syringing her out, she said, call 911. So he's called 911. The hospital was 3 minutes from my house, but I think they showed up probably 5 minutes after the call. They were there. They came in and took over CPR. I was sitting on the couch, and she's like on the couch next to me, and Faith had been working on her, and I'm still sitting there. When they came in, they took over working on her in the same spot. But Faith sat down right in front of me. She was like on her, like she was squat sitting. You know how you squat sit? It's weird how certain things completely a blur. Don't remember that. And then other things are like, I can picture it. I can paint it in a painting. I remember exactly what it looked like. She was sitting there just staring at Aquila, and she had this look on her face, like complete and utter shock and dismay. And she said, I can't believe it happened again. I can't believe it happened again. And it turned out later, like she had been in an abruption. I don't know if she was the lead or she was the other person. I think she was the other person, but she had seen a baby die of an eruption. And so she's just completely shell shocked. And I asked her, I said, they were working on Aquila. And I said, is it possible that she could live after not breathing for this long? And she said, she's not going to make it. She didn't even look at me. She was just looking at her, and she's like, she's not going to make it. And then I was just like, oh, and I just remember it being so like, there was no emotion yet at that point. I was so out of it, so completely delirious that I just, it just is all happening around you. It's like you're almost outside of your body as this is going on. It's like you would think you'd be screaming and wailing at that point, but it's not. It's just so far removed from everything as it's happening, even though it's happening to you. You're just like, oh, she says my baby's not going to live. Like watching my baby there. And it's like later, those same memories are traumatizing, but at the time, it's like very detached, like, in response to it when it's happening.
So did they take her, they must have loaded her up in the ambulance and stuff. Like, what did they do for you?
Well, before, when they were working on her, I was like, I said, I think I'm passing the placenta. I said this to Faith. Remember, she's sitting in front of me and nobody's done anything with me. Like they went immediately to the baby, right? And there's so many people in that room and they're all around her. And I said, I think I'm passing the placenta. And they's like, oh, okay. And I reached down and I pulled up a clot that was like the size of a liver. Like it was in two hands like this, a clot. And I thought it was the placenta. It felt like the placenta. And I was like, that's not the placenta. And then I passed the placenta. And I passed some more clots, like hand-sized clots. And I'm thinking now, and afterwards, I was like, why didn't she give me Pitocin? Like she had Pitocin in her back. She didn't do anything, like nothing. And I'm still bleeding. Then they load her up in one ambulance, and they load me up in a second ambulance. And I find out when I get into the ambulance, I'm like, if you've given birth before, those like cramp gush after you give birth, where you get the like kind of a gush of blood. A small amount in cramp is normal, but I was having those, and I knew I had just passed all these clots, and I was thinking, I'm gonna hemorrhage. Like I can't bleed more, and I'm feeling this, and I'm tell the guy who's like 20 something, so young. I said, I'm bleeding a lot. I'm like, I need Pitocin, and he was like, we don't carry Pitocin in ambulances, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And I was like, I said, I'm bleeding. I'm bleeding out. Like, I need you to do something. And he's like, I don't know what to do. He said, I don't know what to do. And I said, can you give me a uterus? Can you massage my uterus? And I'm thinking it's something I've always hated that they do, when they rub on your uterus. Is who wants them to do that? Nobody. But I asked him, I said, I need you to push as hard as you can and to massage my uterus. So this poor kid, he was just like, he did not want to hurt me. He did not want to do it. I'm like, push harder. I'm like telling him, like, you need to hurt me, like, because I do not want to die. Like, I'm like, I can feel the blood was just like, I can feel it. And I'm like, I'm going to die. Like, you have to do something. So he was like massaging my uterus as I'm directing him. They asked us like what hospital to go to. I don't know why they asked us. I don't know why they said, where do you want to go? And I was like, well, Dell is right there. It's like the one that was 3 minutes away. And they said, well, the children's hospital, we can go to the children's hospital, or Dell was the children's hospital. The North Austin was the one that was right by me. They said, well, Dell Children's Hospital, we can go there. And if we take you to Brackenridge, the two hospitals are connected. So like you can see her. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. But it did not make sense because those two hospitals were 20 minutes away from us, and the other one was 3 minutes away, and it actually had a level 3 NICU. So they didn't even know what they were idiots like in that, because like, and so was the midwife. Didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. It's like they should have taken us both to the hospital where we could have been together instead of taking us to two different hospitals. But that's what they did, and they worked on her for an hour after she came in there. They were never able to get she never had any breaths or cardiac activity. I don't know why they worked on her so long. I know that the people, the staff there were completely traumatized. Like when I heard later, they were just, I was told they kept working because they were so in shock about this baby brought in that they were like trying to, do everything they could. But I mean, at that point it was pointless. Like she'd already been worked on like 20 minutes from birth before she ever got in the ambulance, and then drove 20 minutes there and an hour. It's like they worked on her forever, and there was never, by the time she got epinephrine, it had been way too long. Midwives don't carry that. I don't even think the ambulance gave her epi yet. Maybe they did. I don't know. They definitely didn't give it to her in the room. They had to have done it in the ambulance if they did. So it was way too long at that point. So had they been there when she was first born, I think it would have been possible that she could have lived, but I don't even know. I don't know. I should have been, if I had been in a hospital, she would have been born a lot sooner, because the fever was the root of everything. It turned out I had a choreo infection after the medical examiner reviewed like the placenta and stuff. She said that I had a chorioamnionitis, and when you have that and it's untreated, like you don't get antibiotics in labor and you don't get Pitocin to speed up your labor, it has a 16-fold increase in placental abruptions. So you're 16 times more likely to have an abruption because basically your body, which is under extreme duress as an infection in the innermost part of your body, thinks best thing to do is get this out as quick as possible to detach from what's infected, which is the placenta. And so it detaches the placenta before baby's even out, and then you end up, with no oxygen for the baby and mom bleeding out.